The day Andrew Wolfe was led out of the Holt estate in handcuffs, he stopped in the middle of the front hallway and turned around. Not toward Victor, who was standing by the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back and his face doing something I had never seen it do before and hope never to see again. Not toward the two federal agents who had driven up from the Atlanta field office and were now standing with the careful blankness of people doing a job they are good at. He turned toward me, at the woman who had been introduced to him 7 months earlier as his best friend's new daughter-in-law. The girl from the east side of Decatur who had worn drugstore chapstick to her own courthouse wedding and whose name Wolfe had never once remembered correctly, always calling me Anna, 2 syllables where there was only one. He looked at me the way people look at things they underestimated, pure, concentrated, too late recognition, like a man who has just replayed the last 6 months and noticed every mistake he made and cannot believe he made them. I was holding a blue canvas notebook against my chest, the one Mason had hidden behind the Fitzgerald collection in the library, wedged into the space between the shelf and the wall, the one I had found on a Tuesday afternoon in January when I was supposed to be rearranging the get well flowers that arrived every week from people who still felt guilty. The notebook had Mason Holt's handwriting in it, which was significant because for the 5 weeks I had lived in that house, everyone, the doctors, the nurses, the physical therapist, Victor, Wolfe himself, had agreed that Mason Holt could not reliably produce written language. Everyone had been wrong. Andrew Wolfe understood exactly what was in that notebook and what it was going to cost him. He had a moment to absorb this understanding while the agents waited politely for him to finish whatever internal calculation he was running. Then he turned back around and let them walk him out the door. He didn't say anything. The front door closed behind him, and for a moment the hallway held the kind of silence that has weight to it, that you can feel pressing against your eardrums. But that's getting ahead of things. Let me start from the beginning. Or as close to a beginning as anything in this story actually has, which is the morning I woke up to my mother crying in the bathroom and realized I had known, on some level, for months that this was coming. The wall between the bedroom I shared with my sister Sophie and the upstairs bathroom was the kind of wall they used to build in the 70s, when insulation was more of a suggestion than a commitment. I knew every sound that came through it. The particular creak of the 3rd floorboard, the whistle the hot water pipes made in February, and my mother's crying, which she did quietly and only when she thought we were all asleep, with her face pressed into a towel so the sound wouldn't carry. Sophie was still sleeping. She was 8 years old, and she slept with her mouth open and her arms spread wide, and an absolute confidence in the safety of the world that I envied her every single morning. I lay on my side of the twin mattress we shared and listened to my mother and looked at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since I was 6 and thought about numbers. The electric bill, the water bill, the car insurance on a car that had needed new rear brake pads for 3 months. Tyler's physical therapy copay, which was technically optional, but Tyler played basketball on a knee that had been structurally compromised for 2 years, and refusing the therapy would simply mean paying more for the surgery later. My father's prescription refill. Sophie's school field trip, which was $14 and came due the same week as the car insurance. I was 23 years old, and I had been doing this arithmetic in my head since I was 19, when my father hurt his back at the warehouse, and everything shifted the way a foundation shifts. Not all at once, dramatically, but by degrees, each degree imperceptible on its own, until suddenly the floor wasn't level anymore, and you couldn't remember when it had stopped being level. I got up at 4:30 and went downstairs and made coffee. The kitchen was narrow and clean because my mother kept it that way by effort of will. by the specific stubbornness of women who refuse to let the physical space of their lives reflect the difficulty of the circumstances. There was a plant on the windowsill that Sophie had insisted on keeping alive by force of personality since the age of 6. There was a calendar on the wall with my mother's handwriting on it, doctor's appointments and bill due dates, and Tyler's game schedule, all in different colored pens, as if the organization of it could make it manageable. I had been working at the Kroger on Memorial Drive for 2 years by then, on the checkout line, 6 days a week. It was steady work. The hours were predictable. My manager, a man named Phil who wore orthopedic shoes and treated every interaction with the mild suspicion of someone who had been disappointed many times, was at least consistent in his disappointments and never surprised me with new ones. I was good at the job because I was good at the arithmetic and because I had a face that people felt comfortable complaining to, which is a strange quality, but a useful one. What I had not been was happy exactly, but I had been managing. We had been managing. The managing required a precision that left no room for error and very little room for anything else. But it was a life, and it was ours, and we had arranged ourselves around it with the practicality of people who understand that romanticizing difficulty doesn't make it less difficult. Then Tyler's knee got worse. The physical therapist, a brisk woman named Dr. Chen, who spoke in the language of insurance codes, told us in March that the conservative treatment had run its course and that surgery was now medically necessary, not elective. She said it the way doctors say things when they know the word necessary is doing a lot of work. The surgery was quoted at $16,000 after our insurance coverage. We had $4,000 in savings, which my parents had spent the last 8 years building and which Tyler's PT had already reduced by $1,100. I drove home from that appointment and sat in the parking lot outside our house for 20 minutes, doing the arithmetic again, trying different arrangements of the numbers, and the numbers kept arriving at the same answer, which was that there was no arrangement in which this worked. My father, Charles Price, was a proud man who had spent his life working with his body and who had been forced by a slipped disc and 2 years of medical debt to become a man who watched television from a recliner and apologized with his eyes because he could not apologize with words without it costing him more dignity than he had to spare. He had been a good man before the injury, and he was still a good man after it, just a diminished one. And the diminishment was something our whole family quietly mourned while pretending we hadn't noticed it. My mother, Linda Price, held things together the way certain materials hold things together, not through strength exactly, but through density, through being present in every crack and maintaining pressure in every direction simultaneously. She worked part-time at a medical billing office, and she cooked every meal from scratch, because scratch was cheaper, and she ironed my father's shirts even though he had nowhere to go in them, because she understood that the shirts were not really about the shirts. Sophie, who was 8 and should have been protected from all of this by the simple right of being 8, had nevertheless absorbed the atmosphere of the household with the accuracy of a very small barometer. She had stopped asking for things. She asked instead of the library book that she'd had for 3 weeks and whether we had to return it yet. She asked if the plant on the windowsill could have a companion plant someday, when it was a good time. Tyler was 17 and ran on a knee that hurt him all the time and never said so, because Tyler was built from the same material as our mother, and silence about pain was genetic in our family. He had a partial scholarship offer from a Division II school that was contingent on his athletic performance. Without the surgery, by the end of the spring season, there would be no athletic performance. These were the numbers. This was the arithmetic. And the morning my mother cried in the bathroom, I already knew the answer wasn't coming from the Kroger. I just hadn't figured out yet where it was coming from. Franklin Morse came into my checkout line on a Thursday morning at 9:14 a.m., wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly rent and carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than the suit. He was in his mid-50s, trim, with the kind of careful face that gives nothing away by habit rather than by accident. He placed a single bottle of sparkling water on the belt and watched me ring it up and said, "I apologize for the unusual venue, Ms. Price. I've been told you prefer direct communication, so I'll be direct. I represent the Holt family, Victor Holt specifically. I've been authorized to make you a proposal, and I think it would be worth your time to hear it." I had heard of Victor Holt the way everyone in Atlanta had heard of Victor Holt, the kind of peripheral awareness you have of major weather. Holt Industries, the foundation bearing his family name that had built 2 new wings of the Children's Hospital. The name on the building at the edge of downtown that had the good lobby, the marble kind, which I walked past sometimes on my way to the bus stop. I said, "I'm working." "Your shift ends at 10. I'll be at the coffee shop across the street." He picked up his sparkling water and left. I watched him go through the automatic doors, the woman behind me in line holding a bag of cat food and an expression of mild fascination said, "Was that a lawyer?" Apparently. The shift took 46 minutes to end. I spent 46 minutes doing the math on what a man like Franklin Morse represented and what he was likely to offer, and whether whatever it was would be enough. And then spent the last 3 minutes of the shift telling myself that this line of thinking was dangerous and premature and probably not going to lead anywhere good. I crossed the street. Morse was already at a corner table with 2 coffees. He explained it without drama, the way a man explains a business arrangement, because that was exactly what it was. Mason Holt, 28 years old, the only son of Victor Holt, had been in a car accident 11 months ago. The accident had resulted in a traumatic brain injury. Mason was alive and physically present and not in immediate medical danger, but his cognitive function had been significantly impaired. He was largely nonverbal. He required assistance and companionship. Victor had tried the clinical approaches, inpatient facilities, rotating nursing staff, a residential care situation that had lasted 2 weeks before Mason had, in one of his rare physical demonstrations of preference, knocked the care coordinator's notebook into a fish tank. Victor wanted his son at home. Victor also recognized that his son, despite the injury, was aware of his surroundings in ways the medical team had perhaps not fully appreciated. What Mason needed, Victor believed, was not just care, but connection, genuine human presence, something the rotating staff had not provided. Victor was therefore prepared to offer a marriage contract, structured, legal, clearly bounded. The woman in question would live at the estate, provide companionship to Mason, represent the family appropriately in social contexts, and be available for the duration of the arrangement. In exchange, $8,000 per month deposited to an account in the woman's name. Full comprehensive medical coverage for the woman and, Morse said this without emphasis, which was itself a form of emphasis, for her immediate family members. A housing stipend for her parents should they require residential assistance. A trust account that would vest at the end of the arrangement's first year. I stared at my coffee for a long time. Then I asked, "What does he understand?" Morse paused. "Mason?" "Yes, Mason. What does he understand? Does he understand what I'm there for?" Morse was quiet for a moment, which was the most honest thing he'd done in the entire conversation. The medical consensus is that Mason's receptive language, his ability to understand what is said to him, is significantly intact. His expressive language is compromised. He understands considerably more than he can communicate. I asked, "And does he know about this arrangement?" Victor discussed it with him. Mason did not object. I thought about what that meant. A man who could not reliably say no being asked to agree to something. I thought about whether did not object was the same as consent. I thought about the $16,000 that Tyler's surgery cost and the $4,000 we had and the $12,000 gap between those two numbers. I thought about my mother's face in the morning when she thought I was still sleeping. I need to meet him first. Morse nodded like this was expected. Of course. I met Mason Holt 4 days later at the estate on a Saturday afternoon when the Georgia light was doing the thing it does in April, golden and thick through the trees. Victor Holt met me at the door. He was shorter than I expected from photographs. Photographs of powerful men have a way of adding height, with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes that assessed everything and then, when the assessment was complete, became simply warm. He shook my hand with both of his. Thank you for coming, Miss Price. I want you to know that this arrangement was Mason's willingness, not just mine. I need you to know that. I said, Can I see him? Victor led me through a house that managed to be large without being cold, which is not easy to achieve and suggests either genuine taste or an excellent interior designer, or possibly both. The furniture had the quality of things that had been lived in for generations. There were photographs on the walls, family photographs, the kind that accumulate over decades rather than being curated all at once. Mason was in a lot of them, a boy, then a teenager, then a young man who had his father's eyes and his mother's mouth, assuming that the woman in the earlier photographs was his mother, of whom Victor had not spoken. He was in the sunroom, in his wheelchair, positioned beside a window where the afternoon light came in at an angle that made the room feel almost domestic, almost ordinary. He was tall in the way that wheelchairs make difficult to fully appreciate, long-limbed, with broad shoulders that the chair seemed too small for, as though he'd been arranged into it incorrectly. His hands were still in his lap. His hair was a little too long, the way it gets when someone has had other things to worry about than haircuts. His eyes were gray, entirely, clearly gray, and they were watching me from the moment I walked through the door with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting and is now deciding what to make of what they see. I sat down in the chair across from him because standing felt like looking down at him, and looking down at him felt wrong. Hi. I'm Anna. He didn't respond verbally. His right hand, which had been resting on the arm of the wheelchair, moved. Just slightly, just a small adjustment, the kind of movement that could be involuntary. But his eyes stayed on my face. I said, I know this is a strange situation. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. Nothing from him, except those gray eyes that were doing something the doctors had apparently decided wasn't worth noting. I'm going to be honest with you about why I'm here. My family needs help that I can't provide the way things are. Mr. Morse made an offer that would change that. I said yes because of my family, not because I had better options. I think you deserve to know that. I waited. His left hand moved. 4 deliberate taps on the wheelchair arm, like a period at the end of a sentence. I didn't know what 4 taps meant, but I knew it meant something. The wedding was a courthouse affair on a Wednesday morning with 7 people present. Myself, Mason in the wheelchair in a dark jacket that someone had pressed carefully, Victor, Franklin Morse, a notary, a clerk named Denise who processed the paperwork with cheerful efficiency, and in the waiting area outside where he was ostensibly getting coffee but was actually visible through the glass wall, Andrew Wolfe. I noticed Wolfe the way you notice something bright in your peripheral vision, not because it demanded attention, but because it was there. He was Victor's age, maybe slightly younger, broad-faced and expressive, the kind of man who takes up room in a space without seeming to try. He wore expensive things carelessly, which is its own kind of statement. When Victor came out after the ceremony to find him, Wolf embraced Victor and said something low and warm that made Victor close his eyes for a moment. He clapped Morse on the shoulder. He looked at me with a smile that was generous and practiced and reached exactly as far as his teeth. "Welcome to the family, Anna." "Anna." He called me Anna. I smiled. I said, "Thank you." What I noticed, and I noticed it without knowing why I was noticing it, without knowing that I would spend the next 4 months thinking about this specific moment, was what happened when Wolf turned toward Mason. Wolf's warmth extended to Mason. He crouched down to be at Mason's eye level. He spoke gently. He put a hand briefly on Mason's shoulder in the way of a man who has done this many times and knows exactly how to do it. And Mason went still. Not the absent still of a man who isn't registering what's happening. The other kind. The kind that is the opposite of absence. The kind that looks, from the outside, exactly like absence, but isn't. I filed that away. At the time, I didn't know what drawer to file it in. The Holt estate was 40 minutes outside Atlanta, down a county road that turned to private gravel at the Stone Gate. 10 acres of grounds with a house that had been built in 1887 and periodically updated with varying degrees of success. The South Wing had been a catastrophic Victorian addition in the 1920s and had subsequently been converted into a fairly elegant guest house. The main house was antebellum in the bones and somewhere between grand and comfortable in practice, which I think was deliberate. Victor Holt was a man who had money, but seemed faintly embarrassed by ostentation, which was a quality I respected, even as I was trying to figure out how to live inside his house without feeling like a guest in someone else's story. My room was on the second floor, across the hall from Mason's. The staff were 6. Margaret, the head housekeeper, who was 61 and had worked for the Holt family for 19 years and had a way of communicating entire opinions through the angle of her spine. Jerome, the groundskeeper, who was friendly in the way of people who spend most of their time outdoors and find indoor interactions faintly surprising. 2 day staff housekeepers named Rita and Concepcion, Elias, the cook, who was 27 and classically trained and deeply bored by the dietary restrictions that accompanied Mason's recovery, but who made an effort anyway. And, new to the arrangement and the source of considerable internal household commentary, Dr. Serena Bramble. Dr. Bramble was not precisely a doctor. She held a certification in something called neurological resonance wellness, which she explained to me in the kitchen on my 3rd morning with an energy that I found both exhausting and genuine. She had been recommended to Victor by someone on the board of the Children's Foundation, had presented a research portfolio of disputed provenance regarding the effects of animal presence on cognitive recovery in TBI patients, and had convinced Victor, who was, in his grief, willing to try things that the standard medical literature had not yet endorsed, to allow her to implement what she called a grounding protocol. The grounding protocol consisted primarily of Gerald. Gerald was a Nigerian dwarf goat, approximately 3 years old, with brown and white markings and an expression of such complete self-possession that it was difficult to look at him without feeling slightly judged. He lived by Dr. Bramble's arrangement in the converted sunroom off the east wing, which had been fitted with appropriate flooring and what Margaret described with the particular flatness of a woman who has strong opinions she is choosing not to fully express as appropriate accommodations. Gerald was, within his first week, not confined to the sunroom. This was partly because Gerald had opinions about confinement, and partly because the sunroom doors were of a style that Gerald had determined, through empirical investigation, could be nudged open with his nose when the latch was not properly engaged. The staff re-engaged the latch. Gerald waited until someone opened the door for a different purpose and followed the opportunity through it. Victor had his first encounter with Gerald on a Monday morning when he came downstairs at 6:30 to find Gerald standing in the kitchen with the serene confidence of someone who belongs wherever they are. Victor looked at Gerald for a long moment. Gerald looked back. Victor said, "Good morning." Gerald moved his jaw once in a way that communicated something. Victor nodded, poured his coffee, and went to his study. Margaret, who had witnessed this exchange from the doorway, later told me with the precision of a court reporter that Victor had not seemed disturbed by it, which Margaret found disturbing. By the end of my first week, Gerald attended Victor's morning walk around the grounds as a matter of routine. Victor did not encourage this. He also did not discourage it. He simply walked, and Gerald walked beside him. And occasionally, Victor said things that were probably intended for his own internal processing, but which Gerald received with apparent attention. I liked Gerald from the beginning. He had an honest quality that I found restful in that house. My first weeks at the estate followed a pattern that had been established before I arrived. Mason's morning physical therapy with a specialist who came out Tuesdays and Thursdays. Lunch in the sunroom when the weather permitted. Reading time in the library in the afternoons. Dinner with Victor when Victor was home, which was 4 or 5 nights a week. I inserted myself into this pattern where I could, which at first felt presumptuous and then gradually felt less so. I read to Mason. This had been a suggestion of Dr. Bramble's that I had adopted, not because I trusted Dr. Bramble's neurological theories, but because it gave me a reason to be in the room, and the room was where I needed to be if I was going to understand what was happening. Because something was happening. I was not sure in those first weeks what exactly it was, but something was. Mason was not, in my observation, a man who was absent. The clinical language around his condition described it in terms of deficits, what was impaired, what was compromised, what was reduced. It described the gap between what the injury had left and what had been there before. But it didn't describe the thing that was present, the attention, the specificity of it. Mason tracked movement in a room the way a person who is fully aware tracks movement, not randomly, not reflexively, but selectively. He noticed what was interesting. He noticed what was unusual. He noticed what was wrong. He noticed me in a way that was particular rather than general. I found this out on my 5th day when I was reading to him from a collection of short stories and reached a passage I'd read aloud the wrong way, stumbling over a phrase, and I looked up to find him watching me with something that was recognizably amusement. Not a smile, not exactly. The muscles around his eyes were doing something specific, something that took me a moment to identify because I hadn't expected to see it. "You're laughing at me," I said. His right hand tapped twice on the wheelchair arm. Quick, deliberate. "That's fair." I botched that sentence. 2 taps again. I had not established yet what the taps meant, but I was beginning to understand that they were not random. The other thing I noticed was what happened when Wolf came to visit. Wolf came twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, usually in the late afternoon. He spent time with Victor in the study and then, always, came to say hello to Mason. These visits were brief, 5-10 minutes. Wolf spoke, as he did with everyone, warmly and with generous attention, the kind of attention that feels like sunlight and has similar properties in that it does not actually penetrate anything. During these visits, Mason was still. The specific stillness I had noticed at the courthouse, the one that looked like absence, but wasn't. I tried to explain this to Jolene Reese on the third Wednesday of my new arrangement, at the Wick Sisters' weekly candle night, which rotated between our houses, and this week was at Carmen's apartment, which smelled of vanilla and had 4 different sizes of wax melting in 4 different pots on her kitchen counter. Jolene was my oldest friend, where oldest meant we had known each other since 9th grade and had survived things together that are best left to the imaginations of people who have also had a 9th grade. She worked at a hair salon near Little 5 Points, and she had opinions about everything and expressed them without modification, which was one of her most exhausting and also most reliable qualities. She was sitting on Carmen's kitchen counter eating pita chips directly from the bag and watching me roll a candle in dried herbs with the focused skepticism of a woman who had not entirely bought into this hobby. "What do you mean still? Still how? Like a statue still?" "No, like, you know how a dog goes still when it hears something it doesn't like? Not afraid, alert. Like it's decided to be very, very quiet and very, very observant." "You're comparing your husband to a dog." "I'm comparing his physical response to a specific stimulus to a behavioral pattern that communicates, 'Girl, I went to the same high school as you. Don't use academic voice with me. Something's up with this guy. Say something's up with this guy." Priya Nair, who was sitting at Carmen's kitchen table with her own candle in progress and the focused expression of someone for whom a hobby is serious business, said without looking up, "What kind of something are we talking about? Are we in something feels off territory or something actionable territory?" Priya was a paralegal at a mid-sized firm downtown, and she categorized situations the way her profession had trained her to, by what could be done about them. "I don't know yet. I'm still gathering information." Carmen Diaz, who was half inside a cabinet looking for a wick holder, emerged with it and a theory. Carmen always emerged from things with a theory. She was 24, worked at a coffee shop near Emory, and had a gift for pattern recognition that was not always tethered to evidence, but was occasionally correct in ways that were unsettling. "You know what it sounds like? It sounds like he's communicating through behavior because he can't communicate through words. Like he's been trying to tell you something with his body because nobody's listening to his words because he doesn't have words, and everyone's decided that means he doesn't have anything to say." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "That's actually not the worst theory I've heard," I said. "I know. She's been sitting on that theory for 2 weeks, Jolene said. "She brought it up on the way over here. I told her she was being dramatic." Officially taking that back. We spent the rest of the evening making candles that turned out better than the previous weeks and discussing various things we were going to do. Jolene proposed contacting a local news station. Carmen proposed creating an anonymous social media account to document observations. Priya proposed a more measured approach involving documented notes and a consultation with someone who knew medical legal standards. We agreed enthusiastically with all of these proposals. None of them were what we were actually going to do. But talking through the dramatic versions first was how we arrived at the real ones, which was a process Jolene had identified in 9th grade and which had served us through various catastrophes since. What I was actually going to do was pay attention. I was going to sit in that library and read out loud and watch Mason Holt's face and figure out what the taps meant and whether what Carmen had said, that he was communicating through behavior, that he had things to say, was the correct read of the situation. It was. The book was a Fitzgerald. Tender is the Night, first edition, which meant nothing to me as a reader, but apparently meant something to Mason as an object, because his eyes went to it every time I was shelving and reorganizing the collection, which I had started doing on my own initiative because the library had the atmosphere of a room that had stopped being used, and I thought a room that was being used might help. On a Tuesday afternoon in the 6th week of my arrangement, I pulled Tender is the Night from the shelf to put it back properly after it had gotten out of order, and I opened it to check the edition information inside, and the word was there on the flyleaf. One word, in pencil, small and careful, and unlike the surrounding text, angled slightly upward the way handwriting goes when the writer is doing it against some difficulty or resistance. Help. My hands did not shake. I thought later that this was strange, that my body had perhaps processed something my conscious mind was still catching up to. But in the moment, I simply held the book and read the word and did not move for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt longer. I put the book back on the shelf. I walked to the window that overlooked the south lawn, where Gerald was currently engaged in a protracted investigation of a garden ornament. I stood there until my breathing had returned to something that felt normal, and the metallic taste at the back of my mouth had faded. Then I went back to the chair across from Mason's. He was watching me. He had been watching me since I'd opened the book, and the watching had the quality of someone who has set something in motion and is now waiting to see what happens next. I found the book. His right hand moved. 3 taps, deliberate. A beat, then 2 more. I looked at his face. His face was completely controlled except around the eyes, where something that might have been relief or might have been something else was doing something I didn't have a word for. I'm going to assume 3 taps means yes, and 2 taps means no. If I'm wrong, tap 4 times. He didn't tap 4 times. Did you write that? The word in the book? 3 taps. When? He looked at me steadily. I realized I'd asked a question he couldn't answer with taps. I thought for a moment. Was it recent? Last few weeks? 3 taps. Something adjusted in me then. Something tightened and settled at the same time, the way a knot tightens when you pull the right end. Okay, I'm going to bring you something tomorrow. Paper and a pencil. I'm going to leave it on the table next to you, and I'm going to read, and I'm not going to watch, and you can use it if you want to. 2 taps, then 3. I didn't know yet what 2 followed by 3 meant. I learned later that it was his way of saying no. I mean yes. The legal pad was yellow, the kind you find in any office supply store. I put it on the side table with 2 pencils, because pencils break, and then I opened my book and I read. Not out loud. I read to myself, because the situation felt like it required quiet. Gerald had followed me in from the sunroom and was currently investigating the corner of the rug with the disciplined attention of a small professional. The afternoon light moved. I read about 11 pages of a novel I could not tell you the title of now. Then I heard paper move. I kept reading. I turned a page I had not absorbed. I sat with the physical effort of not looking for what felt like a long time, but was probably 4 minutes. Then I stood up and walked to the table as casually as I could, which was not very casually, and I looked at the legal pad. 3 words. The handwriting was effortful, each letter constructed with the deliberate care of someone rebuilding a skill from the foundation, but legible, entirely, unmistakably legible. Not an accident. The room didn't stop. The light kept moving. Gerald continued his investigation of the rug. The world maintained its normal operational parameters, and I stood beside a side table in a library in a house I had lived in for 6 weeks and felt the floor tilt beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with the floor. I sat back down in my chair. I took the pencil from beside the legal pad. I wrote, "Who?" I put the legal pad back on the table. I went back to my chair. I did not look at the page. The second time I walked to the table was 20 minutes later. He had written one thing: Wolf. I looked at the name on the page for a long time. Then I looked at Mason. He was watching me with the gray eyes that had been watching things in this house for 11 months and storing everything they saw in a place where no one had thought to look. Very quietly, Andrew Wolf. 3 taps. The clock on the library mantel ticked. Gerald sneezed, once with great feeling. I thought about the man at the courthouse, the warmth that reached exactly as far as his teeth, the way he'd put his hand on Mason's shoulder, and the stillness that had come over Mason like something turning off. I thought about did not object. I said, "Does your father know?" Long pause. 2 taps. I called Jolene that night from the bathroom with the water running, not for the drama of it, but because the bathroom was the room in the guest house where I was currently sleeping. We'd moved me to the guest house to give me more space, Victor had said, though I suspected it was also to give the household staff more space from the strangeness of the situation. And the guest house walls were thinner than the main house walls, and I did not want to be overheard. Jolene picked up on the second ring. She said, "Hey, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react loudly." A beat. Okay. The accident wasn't an accident. The silence on the line was the specific silence of Jolene Reese taking something seriously, which was different from her normal silences. Then, holy shit. I know. How do you know? He told me. Anna, he doesn't talk. He writes. Another silence. Okay. So he wrote you that his accident was... Anna, do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you're saying? Because if this is true, that means someone tried to kill him. Yes, I know. And this person is still in the house, regularly, twice a week. I heard Jolene breathe out through her nose, the specific exhale she made when processing something that was too large for immediate response. Then, "Okay, do you need me to come out there?" "No, not yet. I need to think." "You need a lawyer." "I know someone. I'm going to talk to Priya. And you're not going to do anything dramatic or stupid or heroic without telling me first." When have I ever been dramatic? Do you want a list organized by year or by category? Despite everything, I laughed. It was small and brief, and I pressed my hand over my mouth, but it was real. "Be careful," Jolene said. "I mean it." "I know." I sat on the edge of the guest house bathtub for a long time after I hung up. The water was still running. Gerald, who had apparently followed someone across the courtyard and was now audible outside the guest house window, made a sound that was either a commentary on the situation or a request for better accommodations. "Not helpful, Gerald." The sound outside shifted into what I'd started recognizing as Gerald's foraging register. Not a response, just life, continuing at its usual pace, indifferent to the fact that everything had just changed. I talked to Priya the next day on the phone during a drive I took to nowhere in particular because I needed to be moving while I talked. Priya listened without interruption, which was how she listened to everything, completely, storing everything, waiting until the full picture was available before forming a response. When I finished, she was quiet for 5 seconds, then, "Okay, first question. Do you trust what he's told you? Not emotionally, I mean epistemically. Is there any possibility he's confused about this? About what happened?" This was the right question, and I had been asking it to myself for 24 hours. His receptive understanding is intact. He knows the difference between things that are true and things that aren't. And the way he communicated it, it wasn't the way someone communicates a confusion. It was the way someone communicates a fact they've been carrying for a long time and finally has someone to give it to. And the name he gave you, Andrew Wolf, yes. If this is real, if someone deliberately caused the accident, we're talking about attempted murder. That's a federal offense if it crosses state lines, which car accidents generally don't unless the planning does. You need more than his word. You need documentation. I know, I need to ask him for more. Be careful how you document your own communications with him. If this goes anywhere legal, those notes could matter. I know. And Anna, you need a professional, someone who does this. API. Do you know anyone? I know someone. He's careful. He doesn't ask unnecessary questions. I'll text you his contact. Ray Pruitt's name appeared in my messages 10 minutes later with a note from Priya that said, "Ex-cop, retires if the case is weak, digs if it isn't, doesn't charge you for the digless sessions." I called him from the same parked car. He answered with his last name, just Pruitt, and listened to a 30-second version of what I knew and said, "How much of this is documented by you, and how much is the subject's account?" Right now, mostly his account. We're working on documentation. Then I'd suggest you keep working on that in parallel. Get me everything he can give you in writing. I'll start from the accident report and work forward. How long for preliminary? Week to 10 days for an accident of this type. I'll have something for you. He hung up without any further social convention, which I found clarifying. The next note sessions were conducted over 3 weeks. I had refined the system. I would arrive in the library in the afternoon, set the legal pad, read or pretend to read, and wait. The effort cost Mason something visible. Each time he wrote, he was exhausted after. The kind of exhaustion that is structural rather than exertional, that comes from the brain working hard to reroute around damage. I tried to time the sessions for when his energy was best. I kept them as short as possible. He kept making them longer than I intended. The second significant note, written over 2 sessions 4 days apart, said, "Audit." He knew I found it. I stared at this for a long time. Then I wrote, "What audit?" The answer came the next day. Holt End Financials. 2 years. Wolf. I wrote, "He was taking money?" The next day, "Yes, I found records. He saw my search history." 4 days later, accident. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the ceiling of the library, which was plaster and had a water stain in the northwest corner that I'd never noticed before. My brain was running the sequence. Mason finds evidence of financial embezzlement. Wolf discovers Mason has found it. 4 days later, Mason is in a car accident that looks like an accident. And this was the part that made the air in the room feel different. Wolf had positioned himself as Victor's comfort and support in the aftermath, had inserted himself into the grief, had used the access that Victor's trust provided to remain close to the situation, to monitor it, to manage it. While the man he'd tried to kill was in a wheelchair 10 feet from where Wolf sat at dinner. I wrote, "Does your father know any of this?" The answer was the one I already knew, but needed to see confirmed. No. Wolf told him I was reckless driving. Father believes him. The pencil marks were shakier than usual on this one. I looked at them for a long time. The shakiness wasn't just fatigue. It was something else. Ray Pruitt called me on a Thursday evening, 12 days after our first conversation. He had 4 things. The accident report had been filed by an officer, Dennis Graves, who had closed the investigation in 11 days on the basis of driver error and weather conditions. The weather that day had been documented by 3 separate meteorological stations as clear and dry. A pharmacy in Birmingham, Alabama, had sold a compound called ceralide acetate, a synthetic formulation that in sufficient dosage could cause microseizures in adults, which could manifest as a momentary loss of vehicle control, approximately 11 months ago. The purchase had been made through a corporate account attached to a LLC called Meridian Wellness Partners. Meridian Wellness Partners was registered in Delaware. The registered agent for Meridian Wellness Partners was a law firm in Augusta that specialized in corporate formation for clients who preferred their names not to appear on documents. The law firm had represented Andrew Wolf in an unrelated matter in 2019. "That's not proof," Pruitt said. "That's a thread. I keep pulling it. It either breaks or it unravels something. Right now, I'd say 70-30, it unravels something." "What's the 4th thing?" A pause. Officer Graves retired 6 months after closing the case. He moved to Boca Raton. He now lives in a waterfront property purchased for $412,000. His pension, even calculated at the high end, would not service the mortgage on that property. Someone paid him. Someone made a deposit of $45,000 into a secondary account registered in Graves's wife's maiden name, 3 weeks after the Holt accident was officially closed. From a third-party financial instrument. I'm still pulling the thread on that instrument. I was in my car again, in the Whole Foods parking lot 12 miles from the estate, because that was where I went when I needed to think in a contained space. The evening sky was going orange over the lot. A woman was loading groceries into an SUV. A crow was watching the cart return area with professional focus. Normal world, normal Tuesday evening. Somewhere in a house 40 minutes from here, Andrew Wolf had had dinner with Victor Holt and sat across from the man whose son he had tried to kill and eaten very good food and been a good friend. And Victor had thanked him again for being there, for all of it. And Wolf had said, it was nothing. Keep pulling. I'll have more by next week. One thing, the financial audit your source mentioned. Do you know if there are records, documentation of what he found? I'm working on that. If there are digital records and they weren't destroyed in the accident, there may be a backup. People who find things often back them up before they have time to realize they should. It's instinct. I'll ask. I sat in the parking lot for 20 more minutes after the call ended. Then I went to buy groceries, because if I came back without groceries after being gone an hour and a half, Margaret would notice. And Margaret noticing things was something I needed to manage carefully. I bought milk, bananas, one very expensive bar of chocolate, and, in a moment of impulse, a small succulent in a terracotta pot that reminded me of Sophie's plant at home. The next Wick Sisters night was at Jolene's apartment, which was smaller than Carmen's and had better candle-making equipment because Jolene had committed to the hobby with a thoroughness that extended to purchasing professional molds and fragrance-grade oils. We were making pillar candles, and the room smelled of sandalwood and something Jolene called dark forest that was more pleasant than it sounded. I had told Jolene the broad strokes. Jolene had been processing them with her characteristic method, which was to not mention them directly for several days and then land on them from an unexpected angle. "So I've been thinking," Jolene said, holding a candle mold with the focus of someone doing delicate work, "about your whole situation." "Which aspect?" "The part where you're collecting evidence against a man who tried to murder someone and who is currently eating dinner in the same house you live in twice a week." Carmen, who had not been fully briefed but had the context detector of someone who had been paying attention, went still in a way that communicated she was updating her theories in real time. "I have a plan," I said. "You have a direction. A direction is not a plan." Jolene set the mold down. "What is the plan?" I said, "We have documentation of the drug purchase. We have evidence of the financial fraud, assuming Mason's digital backup can be located and accessed. We have evidence that the accident investigator was paid off. We have Mason's written testimony. What we don't have yet is the financial thread connecting everything back to Wolf specifically, and we don't have a way to present this to Victor without Victor having a complete breakdown," Jolene said. "Because this man has been having breakfast with the person who did this. That's going to break him." "I know. And you can't let Wolf know you know anything until you have everything. Because the moment he knows you're on to him, I know that too." Carmen said in the tone of someone who has been following along, "Is he about to do something? Like, is there a deadline?" "Yes." I looked at her. "He's been working on getting Victor to sign a restructuring agreement that would give Wolf executive authority over a specific division of Holt Industries, the division where Mason's original audit records are stored. If that restructuring goes through, Wolf controls who has access to those records. He can make them disappear." Priya, who had been listening with the focused quiet of a paralegal building a case, said, "When is the signing?" "This Friday." "It's Wednesday." "I know." Jolene looked at me across the candle molds with an expression that contained several things: fear, admiration, the particular furious love of someone who has known you since 9th grade and has opinions about your survival. "I am going to say one specific thing, and then I'm going to shut up and let you finish the plan. What I'm going to say is, do not go into a room with this man alone, under any circumstances. Are we clear?" "We're clear." "Okay, finish the plan." I finished the plan. Carmen suggested 3 variations, 2 of which were genuinely creative and 1 of which involved alerting a national podcast. We agreed with enthusiasm and specificity about the podcast option and did not take it further. Priya drafted a legal framework on her phone while simultaneously keeping a candle from overheating. Jolene said very little for the rest of the evening, which meant she was taking the whole thing seriously. What we were actually going to do was simpler and more dangerous and involved a Thursday morning and a room with the right people in it and a notebook that Mason had been keeping in the space behind the Fitzgerald collection for 11 months, waiting. I found the digital backup on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before the signing. Mason had told me to look through a series of questions and 2-tap, 3-tap exchanges that had taken 3 sessions in the cloud storage account his company laptop synced to, which was a personal account Victor didn't know existed, under an email address Mason had created the week before the accident. The password was in the notebook. Not the canvas notebook from the library, a smaller one, the kind with a black cover, that he directed me to by indicating with his eyes the third shelf, the gap behind the atlas, until I understood. I accessed it on my laptop in the guest house with Gerald inexplicably present, because Gerald had followed me from the main house, and the guest house door had not been fully latched, and Gerald had opinions about latches. He was sitting in the corner with the poise of a witness. The folder was called Audit_MW. It contained 847 pages of financial documentation, cross-referenced spreadsheets, and a 14-page summary that Mason had written before the accident, and which was, given everything, one of the most devastating documents I had ever read. It identified, clearly and specifically, a pattern of financial diversion from Holt Industries' operating accounts to a series of shell companies over a period of approximately 7 years. Total amount diverted, $2,340,000. The documentation was meticulous. The conclusion, stated in Mason Holt's clear and professional language, was that the diversion bore the signature of someone with executive access and intimate knowledge of the company's accounting structure. The name appeared at the bottom of the summary: Andrew R. Wolf, Senior Executive Partner, Holt Industries. I sent the files to Pruitt and to Priya simultaneously. Priya's response was 2 words: "Holy shit." The second response, from Priya 5 minutes later, was longer and more useful and began with, "Okay, I'm calling the DA's office contact. Don't do anything until we talk." I sat in the guest house for a moment. Gerald looked at me with his complete self-possession. "We have everything." Gerald moved his jaw once, authoritative, confirmed. I asked Victor for a meeting. This required some management because the meeting I was asking for was not the kind Victor was going to be expecting, and I needed it to happen Thursday morning before Wolf arrived, and I needed Franklin Morse to be present, and I needed Victor to trust me enough to invite Wolf to come slightly later than usual without telling him why. I told Victor there was something important I needed to discuss regarding Mason's situation, which was true. Victor rearranged his morning without asking me specifics, which I think was because he had been waiting for the conversation to happen without knowing what form it would take. The hardest part was telling Mason, not telling him what was happening. He knew. He had been a partner in assembling every piece of this, and the last note he'd written me 2 days before said simply, Thursday. He had underlined it twice. The hardest part was what I said to him on Wednesday evening, sitting in the library with the light going gold and Gerald asleep in the corner. It's going to be hard for your father. He's going to find out who he's been having dinner with, who he's been leaning on. I need you to know that I've thought about that. I've thought about whether there was a way to do this that didn't cost him that. And there isn't. But I want you to know I know what it costs. Mason looked at me for a long time. His right hand lifted from the arm of the wheelchair and reached sideways toward the table, and he picked up the pencil and the legal pad, and he wrote something. Slowly, with effort, he turned it toward me. He deserves to know, and you did this for him too. I read it twice. My throat was doing something I was not going to permit in this room in front of Mason Holt. We did this together. He looked at me with those gray eyes that had been watching everything since January and seeing it correctly every time. 3 taps. I was awake at 4:30 the next morning, which is the time my body defaults to when sleep becomes impossible. I sat at the small table in the guest house with a coffee that had gone warm and the folder of documents on the laptop screen in front of me. and I went through everything one more time. Not because I didn't know it, because going through it was the thing I could do when I couldn't sleep. The outside was quiet. Through the window, I could see the south grounds, the garden ornament that Gerald had been investigating for 3 weeks, the edge of the main house roof against a sky that was still dark, but trending toward that particular shade of pre-dawn that is not quite gray and not quite blue. I thought about where I had been 9 months ago, the Kroger checkout, the arithmetic, Sophie's library book, the sounds through the wall. I thought about what I had told Mason that first day, in the sunroom, with the afternoon light doing its thing. That I was there because of my family, not because I had better options. That was still true. My family's situation had changed. Tyler's surgery was scheduled for the following month. Charles was seeing a specialist. Sophie had started calling me every Sunday to tell me about a book she'd finished. But the reason I'd said yes was still the reason I'd said yes. I hadn't changed the reason. I had simply also become, somewhere in the intervening months, someone who was here for another reason too. Someone who sat in a library and watched a man rebuild the architecture of communication piece by piece and felt that watching as something more than duty. I was not ready to name what that was yet. But I knew it was there, the way you know a door is in a room even when it's dark. Gerald appeared at the guest house window at 5:15 with the purposeful look of a creature who has been awake for some time and has decided that others should also be awake. I let him in. He walked twice around the room and then sat near my chair, and I gave him a saltine from the box I kept in the guest house cupboard because Gerald had trained me well. And we sat together in the pre-dawn in front of the document, and I said to him, "We're doing this in 4 hours." Gerald ate the saltine. Right, okay. Victor's study was a room that suited him, not ostentatious, organized, with the accumulated material of a working life rather than the curated display of a wealthy one. Books with notes in the margins. 2 photographs on the desk, one of Mason at maybe 12 years old, in a baseball uniform, squinting into summer sun. One of a woman I had come to understand was Mason's mother, who had died when Mason was 9. Victor was at his desk when I arrived at 8:50. Morse was in the chair to Victor's left. Victor looked at me with the careful attention of a man who has been managing people long enough to know when someone is carrying something significant. "Good morning, Anna." "Good morning. Thank you for making the time. I know you have a full morning." "You said it was about Mason." "In a way." I sat down in the chair across the desk. "Victor, I need you to listen to everything I'm going to tell you before you say anything. And I need Franklin to be here for all of it. And then I need you to do something." Victor's eyes didn't change. "All right. I need you to ask Andrew Wolfe to come at 9:30 instead of 9. A pause. Victor looked at Morse, then back at me. "What is this about?" "Please, ask him to come at 9:30. I'll explain everything. And Victor, I need one more thing. There's a door in this study that connects to the reading room. I need you to leave that door unlocked." Victor looked at me for a long moment. He was not a man who was easily moved, and he was not a man who trusted easily. And I could see him running his assessment and arriving somewhere I couldn't fully read. Then he picked up his phone and texted Wolf. He put the phone down. "Start from the beginning." I started from the beginning. I laid it out the way I had practiced it, methodically, in order, each piece of the mosaic in sequence, so that the picture assembled itself as I spoke rather than arriving all at once. The first note, the name, the drug, the pharmacy in Birmingham, and the shell company, and the law firm in Augusta. Pruitt's findings about Graves and the deposit, the financial audit and the backup folder, and the $2,340,000 and the 7 years of small diversions that added up to a very large theft. And then the part I had thought longest about how to say, that Wolf had been in this house twice a week for 11 months, that he had positioned himself as comfort and support, that Victor's grief had been the thing Wolf had hidden behind and used. Victor did not move during this. His hands were flat on the desk, and he did not move for the entire 23 minutes it took me to say everything I needed to say. Morse made notes. At 2 points during my account, I saw Morse's pen stop and then resume in the deliberate way of someone absorbing something significant. When I finished, Victor was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then, show me the financial documents. I opened the laptop. He read. He read for 15 minutes with Morse beside him, and the two of them went through the same pages twice. And then Morse said something low to Victor that I didn't hear, and Victor nodded once. Victor said, carefully, as if every word had weight, the accident report. You said it was filed by Graves, Dennis Graves, who received $45,000 3 weeks later. Andrew was at the hospital every day. I know. He was with me when the doctors said the prognosis was uncertain. He was the one who told me Mason was going to be okay. He held my... He stopped. He pressed both hands flat on the desk. He breathed. Morse said nothing. I said nothing. There are moments when saying nothing is the most respectful thing available. Victor said, with the specific flatness of a man who has just understood something and is deciding what to do with it, you said there's a door to the reading room. Yes. He stood up. He walked to the connecting door and he unlocked it and he opened it. The reading room was small, just an extension of the study, with 2 armchairs and a side table and good morning light. I had arranged things before coming in. Pruitt was in the hall with his own copy of the documents, and Margaret, who had been told nothing except that she was needed at 9:15, and who had arrived with the focused efficiency of a woman who understood that being needed was enough, had brought Mason from the library. Mason was in the reading room, in his wheelchair. He had the blue canvas notebook in his lap. He had been there since 9 o'clock. Victor made a sound when he saw him. It was not a word. It was the sound of 11 months of carrying something alone, of the specific grief of watching someone you love be reduced, of all the dinners and the hand-holding and the trust that had been weaponized against him. It was all of that arriving at once in one short, involuntary exhale. He crossed the room and crouched down in front of Mason's wheelchair, the way you crouch in front of someone when you need to be at their level, when the height difference has become intolerable. And he said, I didn't know. Son, I didn't know. If I had known. Mason lifted the notebook. He had prepared this. I had known he was preparing something, but I didn't know what. He turned the notebook toward his father, and Victor read it, and I watched Victor's face as he read, and the reading changed everything in Victor Holt's face simultaneously and irrevocably. Then the front door opened. Andrew Wolf came in at 9:30 exactly, because Wolf was always punctual, because punctuality was part of the architecture of the version of himself he presented to this house. Margaret was in the hallway. She showed him to the study with the precision of a woman who has been told what is required of her and requires nothing further. Wolf came through the study door and took in the room, me at the table, Morse standing, the documents on the desk, the open connecting door. And I watched the assessment happen behind his eyes in the time it took him to cross 3 feet of floor. Victor, His voice landed on Morse, on the documents, on my face. What's going on? Victor came through the connecting door. He stood in the doorway of the study. He looked at Wolf with an expression I had no frame of reference for. It was beyond anger, beyond grief, beyond the vocabulary of ordinary betrayal, because this was not ordinary betrayal. This was the kind that uses love as a weapon. Sit down, Andrew. Victor, whatever this is, let's just sit down. Wolf sat. I stood up. I walked to the desk, and I laid out every document in order, the way you lay out cards, the way you build something visible so that no one in the room can look away from it. I said, the compound is called cerulide acetate. It was purchased through Meridian Wellness Partners, which is your entity, from a pharmacy in Birmingham 11 months ago. The purchase precedes Mason's accident by 3 weeks. Wolf said, that's circumstantial. The financial records go back 7 years. Mason found them. You found out he found them. 4 days later, his car went off Route 78 in conditions that were clear and dry with a blood toxicology that came back clean. The investigating officer's name was Graves. He has $45,000 in a secondary account that appeared 3 weeks after closing your case. The money traces to a financial instrument you control. The room was very quiet. Wolf looked at Victor. There was something in his look that was genuinely painful to witness. Not remorse exactly, but the specific expression of a man realizing that the version of the story he had been living is no longer the one in the room. Victor, we've been friends for 30 years. Whatever she's told you. Victor didn't answer. He turned to look at the connecting door. Wolf followed his gaze. Mason was in the doorway. He had moved the wheelchair himself. The new wheels had better controls, and he had been practicing, and nobody had told Wolf this. And he was holding the blue notebook up so that the last page was visible. The one he had written that morning, in careful, deliberate letters that cost him something I couldn't measure. You have been sitting at my father's table. 7 words. They landed in the room the way certain things land, not loudly, but with a weight that displaced everything else. Wolf went for the door. Pruitt was in the hallway. Ray Pruitt, who had done this work for 22 years and knew exactly where to stand. The federal agents arrived 40 minutes later. Wolf was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and obstruction of justice, among other things that Morse and the DA's office would clarify over the following weeks. Graves was found in Boca Raton within 10 days, pale and cooperative, his $45,000 no longer feeling like a fortune. The restructuring agreement that had been scheduled for Friday's signing was never signed. Victor Holt did not speak to anyone except Mason and Morse for the first 2 days after the arrest. On the 3rd day, he called me to his study. How long did you know? About 3 months. From the time Mason was able to tell me what happened to the time we had enough documentation to bring it to you. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Because you loved him, and I needed everything, all of it, so there was no room to doubt. If I'd come to you with half of it, you would have wanted to believe the other half was a mistake. And then he would have known. And then I would have lost more than 30 years of friendship. Victor looked at his desk. He sat with me at the hospital. He told me Mason was going to be okay, and he sat with me while I waited to find out if that was true. He held my hand. I know. That was the worst part of it. Victor looked up. The worst part is that he used my grief to protect himself. That's the worst part. Yes. He nodded once. We sat in the silence of that being true. Then he said, "You've been here 7 months. You came because of your family. That was the arrangement." He paused. "I want you to know the arrangement is whatever you need it to be. Whatever makes sense for you and for Mason." Victor, yes? I think that's a conversation for Mason and me to have. Something moved in Victor Holt's face, almost a smile, the remnant of one, the kind that arrives when something that has been very heavy gets slightly less heavy. Yes, I suppose it is. The things you don't expect when you set out to do something necessary. That it will change not only the circumstances you started with, but the person you were when you started. That you will arrive somewhere you could not have predicted from the beginning, and that the arriving will feel less like achievement and more like something that was always going to happen, that was moving toward you the whole time while you were moving toward it. I had thought in that Kroger parking lot 8 months ago that I was entering a contract. I understood what a contract was. I understood its terms and its limits and its borders. What I had not understood, what I could not have understood, not from a parking lot, not from the outside, was that you cannot spend 7 months in close proximity to another person's courage without it changing something fundamental about the way you understand courage generally and yourself specifically. Mason recovered. Not completely, not all at once. Brain injuries don't work that way. And his specific injury came with a specific timeline that his therapist described in increments rather than leaps. He was in physical therapy 3 times a week and speech therapy twice a week. And there were days when the progress felt glacial and days when it didn't feel like progress at all. But there were also days when he walked from the library to the sunroom without the wheelchair. There were days when he said things out loud, simply and clearly. "Good morning. Thank you. I'd like that." Short sentences that arrived like small, specific miracles, which I tried not to treat as miracles because treating them as miracles would make the ordinary days harder, but which I registered privately with a feeling I had no category for. He still left notes sometimes. Old habit, he said. One of the first full sentences he managed, in October, 6 weeks after the arrest. Not the legal pad notes anymore. Small ones, handwritten on whatever was available. Coffee cups with notes tucked under them. Post-it notes on the bathroom mirror. A sentence in the margin of whatever I was reading, sometimes complimenting the book, sometimes disagreeing with it. Our relationship did not announce itself. It accumulated, which is the right word, the way certain things accumulate rather than happening. Moments in the library when neither of us was reading. An evening in November when we watched a storm come in over the south grounds, and Gerald stood at the window like a small sentinel, and Mason said, out loud, quiet, "I'm glad you stayed." And I said, "I'm glad too." And we left it there, at glad, for another 2 months, because neither of us was in a hurry, and both of us had learned that things assembled correctly were worth the time. The first time Mason kissed me was in January, on a Tuesday, in the library, with the Fitzgerald collection visible over his shoulder and Gerald asleep on the rug in the corner. It was brief and deliberate and very much like Mason Holt. Nothing wasted, nothing performed, just the thing itself, exactly as it was. I told Jolene on Wednesday, "I knew it! I have been saying this!" "I know. Did I not say this from the beginning? Carmen, She texted me, "I am showing you this text." Jolene, I said, week 2, I said something is happening in that library and nobody listened, and I was right, and I want acknowledgement. You were right. I know. I always am. Then, quieter, I'm really happy for you, Anna. Yeah, me too. Tyler had his surgery in March. He was back on a court by July, carefully, with monitoring, with the specific combination of ambition and caution that characterized him. And the Division II school renewed their interest by September. Charles was seeing a specialist for his back, who was the first doctor in 2 years to speak to him like a person, rather than a diagnostic category. And something in Charles Price's posture had shifted accordingly. Sophie had gotten a dog, a small, catastrophic terrier she had named Chip, which was after the snack, not the character. And she reported on Chip's activities every Sunday with the thoroughness of a documentary filmmaker. The Wick sisters still met on Wednesdays. The candles were better. I had acquired better equipment, which was easier to justify now. And Priya had developed a genuine talent for layered pours that impressed even Jolene. We made candles and drank wine and talked about our lives, which were different from our lives a year ago in specific and important ways. And we made plans, both real and purely theoretical, and we were very good at knowing the difference between those two categories, which is something women who have been through things learn. Gerald had, in defiance of all structural logic, become a permanent resident of the Holt estate. Dr. Bramble's engagement had formally ended 6 months prior, but Gerald had simply remained, because no one had made the decision to unremain him. And Victor had at some point, no one could identify the exact moment, shifted from tolerating Gerald's presence to appearing to actively value it. Victor had, in fact, ordered Gerald a custom-fitted sweater from an Etsy shop in Vermont when the November temperatures dropped. The sweater was gray wool with a small pattern at the collar. Gerald wore it with the air of someone who had expected this to happen eventually. On a morning in late November, 8 months after the arrest, I found the Fitzgerald book. I wasn't looking for it specifically. I was reorganizing again, which had become a habit. The library being the kind of room that rewards sustained attention. And it came out of the shelf and fell open to the flyleaf, the way books open to the pages they've been opened to most. The word was still there. Help, in pencil, small and careful and angled upward. I brought the book to Mason, who was in the library's reading chair with a different book and the cane he used now for short distances, leaning against the arm of the chair. I held up the flyleaf. Should I erase it? He looked at it for a moment, then at me. No, that's where it started. I looked at the word, at the pencil marks of it, the effort of them, the small, improbable courage of writing one word when the cost of writing one word was enormous, and there was no guarantee anyone would see it or understand it or do anything about it. I think it started before that. He looked at me with the gray eyes that had been watching things correctly since the beginning. Yeah, me too. I put the book back on the shelf. The coffee in my hand was warm, the way coffee is on a good morning when time is moving in the right direction, when the arithmetic has finally worked out and the answer is not a gap, but something else entirely. Outside the library windows, beyond the garden, Victor was doing his morning walk along the south grounds, and Gerald was walking beside him in the gray wool sweater with the measured dignity of a creature who has found his place and secured it. And the November light was doing the thing it does in Georgia in November, pale and particular and clear, coming through the old glass of the library windows and falling across the Fitzgerald collection and the legal pad that was still on the side table and the 2 coffee cups on the library table between Mason's chair and mine. I stayed in the library. Mason stayed in the library. Gerald and Victor made their unhurried way around the south grounds, and the November morning continued at the pace of a life that has finally stopped being emergency and started being itself. And that was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough.